Hello and welcome back. So this is the third mock draft video I've posted, but I've done a few more than that, just trying to get a sense of where players are being drafted. And with this particular mock, I wanted to see what would happen if I did the exact opposite of what I've been preaching since the first video on this channel. That is, don't draft a goalie in the top 2 rounds. So just as I mentioned, this was the analysis project that led to the first video on this channel and many other videos, including the goaltending targets one. The reasoning that I gave was that if you draft a goalie in the first round, you miss out on an elite offensive player that is likely harder to replace production-wise than the goaltender you're picking, however good he might be. So lately in these mock drafts, I've been seeing the top 2 goaltenders at this list, Vasilevsky and Shesterkin. They've been going in the first round, usually in that 9 to 11 range, but in one draft I did see Shesterkin go 3rd overall, so clearly, either some of you are messing with me in these mock draft rooms or people aren't on board with this strategy. So I figured as an exercise, I would show you what my team would look like if I ignored the most important rule. So what are the benefits of this strategy? What are the drawbacks to this strategy? And although I've covered those in that first video, the goaltending video, this is what it will actually look like when your team is finalized. So let's take a look at the first 6 rounds. And in this draft, I purposely picked 11th out of 12 just so I could try to target one of these 2 goaltenders in their range where they're usually going. Now quickly, I've been getting a lot of requests for different types of mock draft videos, but there aren't really many people in those draft rooms, and it ends up being an auto draft situation, which does not help at all, especially with salary cap and or auction style drafts. So if any of you want to get together and organize a data draft mock, someone leave a comment below. Everyone else who wants in, comment on that one, and we'll try to schedule something for maybe this weekend or early next week. But in the meantime, here I went with Shesterkin with my first overall pick, breaking the cardinal rule. But there is reason to think about doing this. So Shesterkin had one of the best seasons from a goaltender in NHL history last year, and any other season he probably would have won the Hart Trophy. So let's look at the data. Only 4 times in NHL history has a goalie won the Vezina and the Hart Trophy in the same year. And these are the guys: Carey Price, Josi Theodore, Dominik Hasek did it back-to-back years, which is kind of insane, and Jacques Plante back in 61-62. Now, Shesterkin posted the highest save percentage of the entire group at a .935 and was second in goals against behind only Carey Price in that 14-15 season. The wins totals weren't as high as Price and Jacques Plante, but to be fair, those Canadiens teams during that original 6 era just was not a fair fight. And this kind of gives even more weight to what Price did in 14-15. And for you Habs fans out there, I'm sure you're looking at that picture of Chris Kreider that you pasted to your dartboard and chucking another one at his face in anger. But Shesterkin wasn't just great last year, he was historically great. And it was during a year when scoring was up from 5.9 goals per game to 6.3 goals per game, which likely dropped most every other goalie's stats in that process. So every other goalie was facing that increase in scoring, and their numbers were dropping because of that, and Shesterkin's increased to historic levels. So that just kind of puts things into perspective. Now, for this year, nothing has changed in New York from last year to this, and in fact, his defense may slightly improve in front of him, just having the confidence of making it to the conference finals, and with a guy like Keandre Miller, a year older and looking better every game. So in addition to all of that, he may even score a few goals for your team this year, so that could help your category coverage as well. And I'm only slightly kidding here because he took a couple attempts last year and he almost hit it. I would bet a lot of money that he's going to score this year, so keep an eye out for that. I don't know if they actually count that in your standard category leagues or whatever, but as we head back to the draft results, you'll notice I did follow my 2 elite defensemen rule, and I grabbed Josi and Ekblad with my next 2 picks at this end of this. So this was the snake going this way, and then the third round came back around this way, and I got Ekblad. So these 2 shored up my defense. So this strategy was obviously very goalie heavy and D heavy, but I did follow that 2 elite defenseman rule. And then I go with Sorokin in the 4th round, which would be a good spot to get your G1, but not your G2 if you're following my strategy. But at this point, if you look at both my goaltenders, I now have a .935 save percentage Shesterkin and a .925 save percentage Sorokin. Those guys were top 2 in the league. So nobody will be able to challenge me specifically in save percentage, and they probably won't be able to take any categories, as the two of them combined for 62 wins and 13 shutouts last year as well. Now, very quickly, just take a glance at some of the forwards that I missed out on. So as it went this way, Ovechkin, Huberdeau, Landeskog, Marner, Tkachuk, both of them, Panarin, Gaudreau, Zibanejad, 40-goal Robertson, JT Miller, Aho, point per game, consistent, Pasternak, goal-scoring winger, Stamkos, Kreider, Gensel, Connor, DeBrincat, all of these guys, they do something at an elite level that not a lot of other guys can do deeper in the draft, and especially not on the waiver wire. Now, you can find some decent value a little bit further down, like Philip Forsberg here. Some of these guys, Batherson's a pretty good pick there. But Pacioretty in the 5th round does not make any sense with his injury history. But what you can notice here is that I went D and goalie heavy in the first 4 rounds, and I missed all of these guys. So all of these elite offensive producers are gone, and I now have to overcompensate for that later in the draft. Then I come back and I do take my first forward, and this is in the 5th round, and I go with Evander Kane. So as far as category coverage goes, this was a great pick, and I like to think of Evander Kane as Brady Tkachuk light. So Kane had 22 goals, 17 assists, 39 points in 43 games with Edmonton. His goal per game at .51 was good for a 41-goal pace, so he's a goal-scoring winger to check off that box. He was at a .9 point per game with a massive shot volume at 3.53 shots per game, which was good for 15th in the league. His hits per game numbers are just as impressive at 3.13 hits per game, good for 30th in the league. But amongst fantasy-relevant offensive producers, he has a higher point production than Brady Tkachuk and only a couple fewer hits than Tkachuk. So this graph is sorted by point production, and it shows you the hits. So this is the higher up on this list that you are, the higher point production you have. And then the further out on this graph is the higher hit totals. And if you look at Evander Kane, he's not quite Brady Tkachuk, but he's pretty good. And he does put up a little bit more point production, at least given last year. Now, as we're looking at this point producing hits per game graph, I'd like to remind you that you can get access to all of my charts and visualizations by joining the description, by looking at the description below and joining my Patreon members. For just $3, you get access to all of these charts and graphs. There's a lot of them. There's over 20 of them at this point, and I'll be posting a lot more as we head to the draft. And you can get access to new ones before I put out the videos, because I usually make those first. For $5, you get everything I just mentioned, plus access to the Data Draft Discord channel, where you can essentially use me as your fantasy team's data analytics department. So you can ask me questions about your team. I'll use the same tools as I use for these videos to help you guide your team to the championship. These videos take a ridiculous amount of time, and I'm currently still looking for a job as a data analyst, and every dollar goes towards helping me continue to make this type of content for you, so I don't have to analyze price points and all kinds of crappy data for pharmaceutical companies and want to blow my brains out. So anything that you can give definitely helps this channel, and I definitely appreciate it a lot. But let's get back to the draft results. And for the next pick, I went with Jack Hughes, a bit higher than I usually would take him in the 6th round. And here I'm banking on first round upside in the 6th round. And if you don't know why I chose Jack Hughes, check out my goal scoring centers video or my overproducers video, where I went into his fantasy file a little bit more in depth, and all of those are timestamped, so you can skip right to Jack Hughes if you want to. My next pick was another one that I've explained in a few videos. The fact that Brad Marchand is still available in the 7th round is kind of crazy to me. I completely understand that he won't play until at least Thanksgiving, and he had double hip surgery, so there is definite risk there. But when healthy, he's a 1.2 point per game left wing. He's usually a top, maybe back half of the 1st round, early 2nd round pick, and he drives a lot of offensive production and category coverage for your team. If you want the full breakdown on his file, visit the Marchand timestamp in my buy low targets video, and that's the one where he's on the thumbnail. And then I followed that up with Cole Caufield in the 8th round, and I've mentioned this in another video before as well, but in the second half of last season, after the coaching change, he was scoring at a 50-goal pace. So that's what I'm banking on, picking him in this spot. That level of goal production and shot volume, as well as some good power play production this year, that's what I'm banking on. And, even though this draft format had plus minus, I need to swing for the fences here because the available wingers just don't have that level of upside. Now, right past this, my next pick was Charlie McAvoy. He's another guy who's dropping, mainly due to health, but the main reason he's even in this range, so he's at ADP 132 in the 11th round thus far, and it's obviously because of injury. So in June, it was announced he'd be out 6 months after undergoing arthroscopic shoulder surgery, and his projected return date is early December. So I get it. This is definitely risky in some sense, but here as my D3, I'm willing to take 2/3 of a season of McAvoy and use his production to boost me down the stretch and into the playoffs, as opposed to taking a lesser talent for the entire season. But why would you own him in general? He's not elite in any one category, but he does everything really well. He gets you points, some shots, some power play points, a good hit number, and a good blocks number at 1.98 and 1.65 blocks per game and hits per game. So he does a lot of category coverage, and he's pretty much in line with my hits and blocks video strategy of drafting your D3 to cover those categories specifically. And in that video, I mentioned Jacob Trouba, Darnell Nurse. I thought about adding Mackenzie Weegar to that list, but he's a little bit low in one of those areas. I can't remember which one it was, but he was like 120th in either hits or blocks in the league, so a little bit lower than those other two guys. But these D3 strategy, these are guys that are going to get you overall category coverage for a lot of different things, even though they're not elite in any one thing. And what I'm banking on here is that he comes back healthy and he starts putting up these numbers, and that I can ride that wave into the playoffs and then use this to my advantage in a head-to-head playoff matchup. I then go after some nice deep value on Joe Pavelski and Roope Hintz, and I didn't necessarily mean to stack the two guys from the Dallas Stars, but Hintz scores at a 40-goal pace and a 75-point pace, and Pavelski eclipsed those marks with a .98 point per game last season, 81 points in 82 games, and 27 goals to boot. So Pavelski he'll boost shot coverage as well with a 2.63 shots per game, and power play points with a .3 power play points per game average, good for 25 power play points last season. And he's dual position eligible. I believe he's a center left wing, but he's a center and a wing, so he gets you dual position. That definitely helps, especially because I have a left wing here, a right wing. Well, he's listed as a left wing, but he might get dual at some point. But yeah, dual position eligibility was not factored in as much in this draft as value, because I just didn't have the offensive horses in the top part of the draft. I had to, just for this exercise, I had to take goaltenders. So as we look a little bit further down, I could have decided not to go with the G3 at all, considering my strength at that position. But I do know, as I discussed in that goaltending targets video, that Shesterkin and Sorokin are both in the low 50 game range and for starts. So if I can handcuff Sorokin with Varlamov, I up my start volume to 82 games for the Islanders tandem, plus the low 50s number for Shesterkin, and I add some shutouts as well. So this is a quick little bonus stat. So Varlamov in 2021 had a .929 save percentage and 7 shutouts. 5 of those shutouts came against the Rangers. So if you ever see Varlamov on the waiver wire and he's playing the Rangers, try to pick him up ASAP, because for whatever reason, the Rangers cannot score on this guy. I would know. I watched every single one of those games, and it was frustrating, to say the least. So very quickly, going to cover my last 4 picks here. With Kempe, I'm looking at his 35 goals from last year, and although I do think he's due for a little bit of a regression from that number, he is good value in this range, and he's usually dual position eligible. Now I always grab my boy Radko Gudas for hits coverage, if possible, because he's got 4.6 hits per game, which, as I've mentioned in other videos, is way above anybody else in the league. The third place hitter was Jacob Trouba, who averaged 2 hits per game fewer than Radko Gudas at around 2.6. So when you pair Radko Gudas with a guy like Tanner Jeannot, you're pretty much covering your entire hits category with just 2 positions. And a guy like Tanner Jeannot, you could substitute Tom Wilson if he was healthy. He's going to be hurt to start the season. Or even Brandon Tanev. And I mentioned in a previous video, a lot of people forget about Tanev, but he was hitting at like 4.4 hits per game in his previous full season with Pittsburgh. And he does score a little bit, so it's not quite the same goal production that you'd get out of Jeannot or Tom Wilson, but he does hit everything that moves. So those are three hits targets guys that I would go for to try to round out that category and cover it with just two players. And then on top of that, of course, I added Evander Kane and McAvoy as well, so I should win hits every week with this strategy. Now, the other pick, I made an entire video about Matt Barzal and what's happening with his fall from grace in the ADP rankings. So he used to be a 6th to 8th round guy, now ADP 158 in almost the 14th round. If you want the full breakdown on that, check out my Matt Barzal video. I'm probably not going to link every single video that I've mentioned in the description on this video because I've mentioned almost every one of my videos by now. But if you like this content, be sure to browse my channel for whatever it is you may need for your team or strategy heading into your draft. But this is what the team shakes out like at the end of the draft, and this is what it looks like as a whole. And as you glance at this, what you notice is obviously I'm very strong in net and on defense. My goaltending categories should be unmatched by anybody in the league. And in a head-to-head matchup in the playoffs, that makes a difference. When there is scarcity at a position or a category and you have 2 to 4 of those guys on your roster, it becomes almost impossible for anybody else to challenge you in those categories or for those positions. I mentioned this in my wingers versus centers video and basically came to the same conclusion about goal scoring wingers. There's only about 7 or 8 of those 40 goal pace wingers in the league, and if you have 3 or 4 of them, unless somebody else has Matthews and a great supporting cast, they're not going to be able to touch you in goals. And the same thing could be said here for my goaltending, especially with that save percentage that I mentioned before, in the an average of about 930, 925 amongst all 3 of them. So the next thing that you notice is that my forward group has a ton of risk baked into almost every file. None of these guys are safe, reliable point producers, and my offensive production will lag compared to guys who drafted wingers or centers early. Now, if everything falls into place, I may be able to make up for that by going high upside with these players, guys like Hughes, guys like Marchand, guys like Caufield. If they hit their ceiling, if everything happens the way that, it needs to happen, then I might be able to hang on and win some playoff games. But, all it takes is one injury to a guy like Hughes, worse injury news for a guy like McAvoy or Marchand, a new allegation coming out against Evander Kane, and my season is completely shot. So that's what happens when you take goalies too early. You have to apply a high risk, high reward strategy with your forwards in order to try to compensate for the overall lack of production. And when you do that, the added risk could potentially destroy your team. Now, if you did it the opposite way and you were starting to take a little bit more risk with your goaltending, the reason why that works out more often than not is because teams are using more goalies now. So if you have a bona fide number 1, if you can back that up with a number 2 who starts 50 games, then what you can do for your third goalie, if your guy's not working out, you go to the waiver wire, you pick up somebody who's hot, you ride him for as long as you can, or you play the schedule and you try to pick up a goalie who's going to be playing, that team's playing 4 games that week, and you pick up the backup goalie who's going to play the more favorable of the back-to-back matchups. So you can do that a lot more effectively than what you can do with your forward group. So right here, if any of these guys, like Marchand's hurt, so I immediately have to go to the waiver wire to try to pick something up to fill his spot. And what I'm going to get on the wire is not going to be the same as Brad Marchand, obviously. But I think the relative strength of the player that I'm going to get on the wire for the left wing position is going to be, potentially different from a goalie that I could pick. For example, I mentioned this in the goalie video 2 years ago when Shesterkin first came in the league. I think I drafted Lundqvist in like the 13th round, but he was in that 3-way timeshare with Shesterkin and Georgiev. And so nobody drafted Shesterkin. He kind of came out of nowhere. But once he started to play, I watched immediately and I knew that he was going to be really good. So I went to the waiver wire, picked him up. I did the same thing with Alex Nedeljkovic. And those two guys that I picked up off the waiver wire helped me win my goaltending categories. Now, that does not happen with 50 goal guys. That does not happen with 40 goal wingers. So that's the difference. And that's what I'm trying to display with this exercise. Now, this is an analysis project I did for my own league, and we've been running this league for a long time, so there was enough historical data to do a decent dive into whether or not offensive category coverage is more important than goaltending. And spoiler alert, it is. So as we look at this analysis here, what you're going to notice is that the people at the top of this list are at the top of the rankings. So let's start most recently and work backwards. So AC Delaware River in my league, 66% of the time he won his offensive categories. This is all 6 categories combined and how often he won those categories. And so he finished first in offense and he finished first in the rankings in the regular season and then won the league as well. If you look at 2021, he was first in the league in offense. He was 6th in the regular season, so he didn't have as good a goaltending. I was number 1 in the regular season. As you can see from the combined percentage, I had really good goaltending that year. And he beat me in the championship game because look at my offense, 50%, he has 57%. So his offense was slightly better than mine and he edged me out in a head-to-head matchup because of that. Then you look at 1920, I had the best offense, I won the league. And then if you look at 18-19, 2 guys were tied. So Zodiac Braves finished 5th in the regular season, 3rd overall. So that offense boosted him in his playoff matchups as well. And then Wolfish finished 1st and lost in the championship game. This year was a year we had plus minus as well. And Lake Mohawk Moose boosted his plus minus categories and won based off of that. Now, the other aspect of this is that the opposite is true. So if you look at Portland Rivercats here, 35% of his offensive categories, and he's in 9th place. Then you look at 1920, Ottawa Truckers, 23% of the time, and now he's down here at 10th. And then if you look at 2021, Zodiac Braves at 20%, he's all the way down here, 10th in the regular season, 9th overall. And then 21-22, Wolfish, 34%, and he's at the bottom of the league. So what this tells you is that you need to pay more attention to your offensive categories than your goaltending. And if you do what I'm advising that you don't do and pick your goaltending early, this is what your team will look like, as I just showed you. And this is not necessarily a recipe for success. So just one more quick look at the team. This is what it'll look like if you ignore my advice. You have great goaltending. That's awesome. You have good defense. I didn't ignore those rules. I pretty much followed every other strategy in my videos except that goaltending rule, and this is what the team looks like, and we are potentially going to struggle offensively, and that's where you don't want to struggle. You want to make sure that you're boosting your offensive categories. So hopefully this provided you with a little bit more strategic value as you head into your drafts. We're about 2 to 3 weeks away from drafts starting. So remember, if you want to be part of that mock draft, somebody leave a comment. Everybody pile onto that comment. We'll see if we can get like 12 guys together, do a mock draft at a specific time. Of course, all of you are going to know my strategy at this point, so I won't have an advantage. So it'll be a good, interesting exercise for all of us. But I want to thank you again for paying attention until the end, and I will see you in the next one.